Okay, 3 points that team government has brought up. Firstly, is that criminalizing victimless crimes isn't justice, and the justice system isn't proportionalized, and that crime victims and that we can't justify decriminalization because crime victims are caused by factors out of their control. And lastly, their point is that they will give aid to the poverty community to deter them from doing these victimless crimes. And that on that last point, I will answer that last point in my substantives. So firstly, my first response to their two main points of how the justice system isn't proportionalized and we can't criminalize criminalize victimless crimes. Okay, sure. We agree that victimless crimes are most likely caused by factors outside of individual control, but it is still a criminal act. So what makes something a crime, right? So there are 2 points. So firstly, it violates or opposes the law, and secondly, it disturbs the peace of the society. So this is where I'm going to heavily focus on, because, like, for example, if you know that there is a drug addict in a specific area, would you let your kids go there? And would you feel safe in that area, right? So, or example, like a prostitute, for example, that you know there's a prostitute in that area, you'd of course be more wary around that area, or try to avoid that area at all costs in the first time. You know, so so even if they are victimless, it still disturbs the peace of their surroundings. You could say that sure, they are not hurting anybody or not hurting any victims, for example, but they are still hurting the environment or the surrounding that they are in currently. So it's still enough to be a crime because it fulfills the criteria of it being a crime in the first place. So it's completely justified for us to criminalize it, and it's also completely proportional, as it conforms, or the punishment is equal to what the perpetrator did because they still caused harm to the surrounding. Anyways, moving on to my main speech here. So let's look at the context on why these motions exist in the first place. So it might exist because of the rising number of victimless crimes in major areas such as the US, LA, California, etc., or maybe even in Indonesia. You know, there are online gambling cases, online loans, etc., right? So why is this significant then? Because it raises a question on how should we effectively solve that problem through the justice system, you know. And government, of course, they want to give rehab options but you know, the problem here is that there is no consistency, and I will explain that in my arguments. So our stance here is that we want victimless crimes to be criminalized, as it is the most effective way to solve the ongoing problem in the status quo. So what's the mechanizations here? So we would actually do criminalized crime as the same as the SQ. So we give a little tweaks. So firstly, they are forced into rehab, and after rehab they are given a job, and and post rehab the aid would still be given financially after job, but slowly decreases as the perpetrators gain more income, higher income, as they get a job. So how is this effective then? So the premise here is that on government side, I assume that rehab is optional, and that comes as an offer to them. So the first problem here is there is no consistency. 2 points. Firstly, it's still very much an option, so they can choose to go into rehab or not. And there are still people, and secondly, there are still people who are addicted. So why are there still people who are addicted then? So let's look at LA, for example. So most of the addicts there, although they have been given rehab options in the thousands, most of them they are more likely to choose to live on the street, right? They don't want to get into rehab or get into shelters, right? So why does this happen? Because it's much easier for them to stay out in the streets rather than actually getting back to society or getting a job, right? How's this the case? Because because firstly it's easier to rely on government aid, and then the competitive job market and the limited job opportunities that exist in the current status quo, right? So even if they don't have a criminal record, it is still hard for them to find a job without knowing what to do, or knowing who to contact, right? So the problem is not about giving an option to rehab. It's about coercively giving them rehab. It's about the way we give them rehab. That's the problem, you know. So how we solve this problem is that we need to force them into rehab. We need to force them into rehab, and that needs criminalization and coercive actions. So like for example, in jail they are forced into rehab, and after rehab they are given a job immediately, or given the means to get a job post rehab, right? So and lastly, on my point on how even if we give aid to the poverty communities, it would still be ineffective. So let's talk about poverty and prostitution and etc. So government said that giving them aid they want to give them aid to gradually help them out of poverty, right? So I assume this is checks, monetary funds, and etc. Right? So and these aids or welfare aids are most likely to be parameter based, right? So for example, if you're below a certain level of wage, you are eligible for said aid. And here's the problem: they could fall into a welfare trap. So a welfare trap is that let's for example, someone who is in poverty relying on government programs, they get into rehab or whatever program the government proposes, and the rehab is successful, they get a job, but that job is just enough to get them out of the welfare program or disqualify them out of the program, but it's not enough to cover the same cost as they did when they are relying on their welfare program. So even if we give them aid, they would still be exposed to this trap and get back to poverty again. And as the government said, poverty causes prostitution and drug use, etc. So it's a stagnant cycle if we give them aid. So it would still be ineffective, as it only fuels the cycle, the road that the wheel that fuels poverty, and it's just an ineffective way to solve poverty in the first place. That's why we want to solve this by actually after rehab. Of course, I said that after rehab we will give them a job or the means to get a job, and when they get a job and after they get a job, they will still receive aid. They will still receive aid such as monetary aid and etc. But that aid would gradually phase out as their incomes get higher from the job. So comparatively, on our side, we solve the issue effectively. We solve both poverty and the issue of victimless crime, and we actually give them a better chance to get back into society. And while on government side, it only fuels a stagnant cycle and doesn't solve the problem effectively, as there is no development and no consistency whatsoever from the government. If we use the proposal from the government, and that is why we are so glad to propose. Thank you.